Well, I appreciate Rich giving me that introduction, and it's always good to be with you. I want to say thanks to Rich first for introducing me. Sometimes that's a challenge when you're introducing your boss, but he followed the script exactly right. But it was still twice as long as it needed to be, so we have to still work on that one. But I do appreciate the chance to come and talk to AFCEA and the TechNet Asia-Pacific. I had that opportunity last year to address as well, and it's always a privilege to do that. So I want to thank Bob Wood once again in your role as the president of the association for this opportunity, and Jim for your chapter leadership, the great growth that's happening here in Hawaii under your leadership. But to both of you, thanks for this opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you today. Of course, it's always appropriate to greet you with aloha. That's a great word around here. It's almost as good as good morning. Actually, it's much better because it allows us to both greet and farewell people, and it describes a spirit that's always out here in Hawaii. I hope that you are all enjoying being here in Hawaii, because it is a fantastic place to hold conferences and symposia like this one. And it's not because of the beauty. That's here too. I mean, I saw the most incredible rainbow coming in this morning. We usually get those in the evening, and we had a morning rainbow. And it looked like it was terminating right about here. So I'm trying to find that pot of gold that somebody's got up underneath their chair. That'll be the prize for today and can go to the scholarship fund if the pot of gold is actually discovered. But it's not just the beauty. It's really, it's the extraordinary circumstance that exists here at a place where we have all of the service components of U.S. Pacific Command in one place. It's the only place that happens in the world. There is no other combatant command, the geographic combatant command, that has all of its components in the same place, and certainly not with the seniority that we have in U.S. Pacific Command. So doing it here has its greatest value in the access that you have to those who are practicing the current art forms that we have of securing our nation and our interests. So I'm glad that you're here, and I think that you're in the right place, and it looks like you've got another great conference lined up. I'm going to share some thoughts with you from the Army perspective with a joint bias. And I say that because we operate as part of a joint team always. And even though I'm responsible for generating the Army capabilities and bringing them to bear on behalf of the joint team, and thus must concentrate on the Army, it's for the purpose of fitting into the joint team. All of our tough problems, all of our wicked problems that we face in this region demand a joint solution, and often a multinational, a whole of government type of solution. And there are all sorts of challenges that arise in such an environment as that, especially in the arena of interoperability. And I think that it causes us to think differently about what it means to have degraded communications. Now, I'm going to work that a little bit this morning because I would tell you that before we even have contact with the enemy, with any adversary that would seek to do us harm or to disable us, we find we have degraded communication. And so your theme of fighting to communicate and really working through the degraded communication environment is a great theme. It's a great theme. But as I said, I'm going to take you in a slightly different direction than perhaps what one would think about when they first see that theme and contemplate on it. I'm going to talk about what happens even before you have contact. Now, I will tell you that I am a landsman and I'm an infantryman. So that means that I'm not in the sea service. I'm not in the air forces. I operate on the ground. And I'm an infantry officer on the ground, which means that everybody else in the entire joint force works for me. No, certainly as it regards the necessity of support. You know, we acutely recognize that in the infantry, that without support, without enablers, without expanding our capability, then that frail flesh is about all you're going to have to work with. and that's generally not going to be enough. So we think about communications from the perspective of how important it is for us to be able to operate. And I often tell Wayne Brock, Jeff Ray, and the other signal leaders who are in the room here today how important it is, how critical it is for us to have communication first. I've got to stretch my network to wherever I have interest in going before I can begin to maneuver. Because if I don't have that, if I haven't stretched the network to the places where I intend to be, the place where I seek to have an advantage, the place where I'm supporting the joint team, then I can do nothing when I get there. It's kind of like that frail flesh idea without support. And so that's how I view communication. And I think you should know that, to know that I'm a believer and an advocate, I hope, but also one who provides challenge to the communication electronics arena, because I am not satisfied. And it is not easy to satisfy me on things like this when it comes to operating, but certainly when it comes to thinking about communications, electronics, technology, enabling us, we have a long way to go before we can be anywhere close to satisfied. So let me just talk about some of those challenges just a little bit. I think that we have to recognize in this region we've got a very diverse set of allies and potential partners. And I group those two distinctly because they're not the same. Sometimes we think about allies, and while we have the greatest number of alliances that our nation holds, 5 of the 7 treaty allies are in the Asia-Pacific region, the fact that they're bilateral alliances mean that every one of those alliances is different. And the fact that there are 31 other countries in the region beyond those 5 says to us that you can't count on the alliance structure being the way you're going to operate. More often than not, we'll be working with someone who is an ally at a base, but someone who's not an ally as an additional partner, whether it's responding to a crisis in their country or finding ourselves confronting the same problem together. And so it's the allies and the potential partners around the region that really shape the nature of the types of coalitions we would have to engage in and undertake. These are ad hoc coalitions. So we don't have the benefit of standing agreements like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has. The STANAGs out there that specify exactly how things are to be. What size caliber, what frequency, what part of the spectrum they're supposed to operate in, what procedures are to be done, how consensus is achieved. Everything is standardized in that alliance, but not in these. And so it's a much greater challenge that I think that faces us. That's before you add the extraordinary dimensions of this region, the time and distance factors. 52% of the world's surface, more than half of the world's population, several thousand languages, 36 different countries, 16 different time zones. As you can imagine, to operate in this area is to operate in a degraded communication environment. And so that's where I want to take you for a little bit. I will share with you that, and many of my staff have heard me say this, I view the Indo-Asia-Pacific region and our experiences inside of it as kind of the world's largest battle lab. This is a place where innovation and experimentation can occur because we've got some extraordinary stimulus out here. You name it, we have it in this environment. Whether it's disaster response or the world's largest militaries, the peer competitors, allies and partners, as I mentioned, the ring of fire, you name it, we have it. And so it's a tremendous place to shake out concepts and capabilities. And we welcome that whenever that occurs. One of the innovations we've undertaken is an operation we call Pacific Pathways, and I'll just use that as a way to express some of the things and some of the experiences that have told us about this degraded communication environment. And so just again, in a nutshell, Pacific Pathways is a both innovation and experiment for us to change the way we project our forces into the region for those many exercises and events that we undertake in a given year. And we'd have more than 130 different activities and actions throughout the region for the Army in a given year. But we've chosen to bring together certain exercises that allow us to stay in a geographic area by going from one exercise to another and to another with one single unit taken from a brigade combat team and tailored down for the purposes of those exercises. And it allows us to stay west of the international date line for 3 to 4 months for every one of these operations, which we do 3 times a year. So in other words, somewhere between 9 and 10 months worth of presence west of the international date line with forces that have been projected away from our primary base structure in the East Pacific or in the Mid-Pacific. And so that's what Pacific Pathways is, and we've done 4 of these operations since 2014, over about the last 18 months. And it has proven to be very beneficial to us in terms of learning about the region and learning about our challenges and the region's challenges that we confront inside of that. And so as these task forces move around and conduct their exercises in the region, we find that we learn about our own ability to shoot, move, and communicate, whether we're ready to do the things that we need to do. And in large measure, we find that we are. So our training programs are yielding good fruit in that regard. But we also find where we have deficiencies in our ability to communicate over great distances, where we have different look angles to different satellite networks and parts of the spectrum, where we have challenges on how much data we can move into what systems and how we touch our joint teammates and our multinational and whole government partners. We find all of that. We find that there are significant gaps, and that more often than not, we're going to operate degraded, even before the enemy shows up. Let me just share a couple thoughts about interoperability, if I can, and then I'll roll back into some examples that we've seen from these Pacific Pathways operations. And I think this short journey on interoperability is important, because that's ultimately what we're looking for. As we find ourselves going out into the region, it's important that we're able to operate with partners and allies. And we don't know who they are in advance. We do know that they cover a wide spectrum of capability. Some of them are near the cutting edge with us in their communications and their technology. Some of them are at the trailing edge, where they're still operating in frequency modulation and very old radio systems. Some of them are in a kind of a hybrid communication environment for command and control, where they're literally operating by cell phones and text messaging. And we know that in any one of these cases, we have to be the key player to whom they connect. So if we're involved, chances are we're the ones bringing the network, we're bringing the command and control systems that make it possible for different participants and different players to work together. So interoperability, then, our ability to work together with others, is a really important consideration. We think that there are 3 different types, and I alluded to this last year and I'll review it again. 3 different types of interoperability that have to be considered and applied. The first is a technical component of interoperability. It's that ability for systems to share data with one another. You know, in infantry terms, it's a "can you hear me?" level of interoperability. Can you see my blue icon? That's the base level of what we're talking about in technical interoperability. Secondly, there's a procedural component to interoperability as well. And that's where our doctrines and our standing procedures make it possible for us to work together, where they're compatible. Our approaches are compatible. Now, again, in infantry language, that would kind of yield the questions like, when do you update your blue icon? Does your icon mean the same thing that my icon means? These are baseline questions in the procedural or doctrinal aspect of interoperability. But finally, there is a human domain of interoperability as well. It's a, if you will, a cultural component to interoperability, where we have to consider the extent to which and the circumstances under which a given partner is willing to share, no matter what your radios can do. And that's a different one that also must be part of the equation. Will you let me see your blue icon? Will I let you share my transport layer? Will I let you dock into my stack? These are cultural, human domain questions. And these are the kind of things also that impact it. So, in order to achieve this interoperability that we seek, we find we have to have a measure of all three of these components brought together. Because the absence of those components tends to leave us into a degraded communication environment. And the presence of those three components makes it possible to work through any degradation that would occur. Now, we saw this during our first Pacific Pathways operation in 2014. And that particular operation had a unit from Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State being tailored down and projected to Indonesia, then to Malaysia, and then to Japan. So 3 very different partners, 3 different operating environments, 3 different sets of activities, 3 different look angles into space, 3 different conditions with regard to our military-to-military relations. And we learned a lot from that. We learned a lot. I was able to go and see those troops out there in action during that, especially down in Indonesia. I also touched them in Japan, but particularly when I saw them in Indonesia, they were making it work somehow. But there were some very clear challenges. As we found with Indonesia, we've been improving our military-to-military relationships, and that has resulted in a significant amount of foreign military sales to the Indonesian Army and sales of equipment that's U.S. equipment that is compatible, that would appear to be interoperable, like the Harris radio, the PRC 117 Golf. Great radio, is doing a great job for our troops, and is in the hands of Indonesian Army troops. Hey, we got a technical connection here. So on the surface, that looked pretty good. But we found that we had some technical interoperability. We even had some procedural interoperability because our radio telephone procedures were the same. We're transmitting information back and forth seamlessly, except there's one piece missing. Couldn't understand what was coming out of the radio at either end. And so we found that we had to add that third layer, which is humans compensating for the last part of interoperability that wasn't present. And that was the ability to have message sent, being message received, and understood in either direction. And it required humans who were bilingual as the translating instrument to make it possible for the rest of that system, technically and procedurally, to provide us interoperability. That's not very efficient, but it worked. It's a workaround, folks, because our systems aren't able to take care of that language problem yet. Only our humans are. So they had to go beyond just interpreting what was coming over the radio. They had to really understand as well. And we saw this as we were doing complex live fire events in not on a traditional range, but really beside a farm in a part of Indonesia, where we had to clear those fires, make sure we didn't have any secondary fires going into an active farm where people were actually in the fields. 2 different types of aircraft involved, U.S. attack helicopter Apache and Russian-built Hind helicopter in the same flight operations, providing air-to-ground support over top of U.S. and Indonesian troops on the ground. So they had to do more than just be able to translate. They really needed to understand what was going on and to work around this at each level. And that's what we had to do, is work around to make it possible. All right, my point in this is the nature of the demand that's out there. So as we're thinking about how we enable the U.S. force in particular, we must always think about the fact that there are others who are in different parts of the range of capabilities, and even when they had the same, there's still a gap, and we're going to be degraded. And we'll have to find ways to work through that. Let me give you another example. The most recent Pacific Pathways operation. It's the fourth one we've done, and the third one this year. This particular one took a brigade combat team from Alaska and tailored it down, sent it to Mongolia, then to Japan, and then to the Republic of Korea. And I went and visited them just a few weeks ago in Korea, and I found some great things happening along the banks of the Namahan River, a place that Bob Wood knows really well from his times over there in the Great Second Division, which, by the way, now is a combined division. U.S. and Republic of Korea combined in the same headquarters staff. But there they were on the banks of that river doing a river crossing operation. So these troops from Alaska joined with some troops from Hawaii who were combat engineers, bridging engineers, and two different brigades of Republic of Korea Army troops underneath of a rock division within a rock corps crossing a river opposed against another Republic of Korea corps. Live. And I saw some marvelous things. I went and met with one of the brigade commanders and our task force commander, who was a lieutenant colonel at that time. And there they are, in the command post vehicle of the Korean brigade commander, who has tactical control over these U.S. forces. And I'm looking at their electronic displays, and that was a great news thing there, Woody. If you remember when we were back in Korea, there was no such thing as these electronic displays, and certainly not in the ROC Army at that time. We were on acetate maps. But they had these electronic displays up. I noticed there were two of them. And so the questions began. So tell me about the two different systems. Well, the good news is I could see their blue icons, and I could gain an understanding of what they're doing because we had doctrinal compatibility on what their icons meant and what it meant on a map. And the map was the map, even though it was electronic. That language I understood. But all the notations around it, I could read some of it, but didn't understand really any of it. Beside it was a U.S. Blue Force tracker system that had been pulled out of the Stryker and moved into the command post vehicle of the ROC Brigade Commander, because the electrons don't touch between those two systems. This is an ally. This is a fight tonight partner, and the data does not cross. Their icons cannot be seen on our system. Our icons are not seen on their system, so we have to put in two different systems. Well, that's a degraded condition, because now we have an air gap that has to be bridged by something, by humans mostly. But oddly enough, we find even when we do that, we still have interoperability gaps. The problem this time was a secondary problem. It was electrical. Their systems draw different amps than our systems draw. So even when we think we have a technical solution, we're still going to operate degraded. That's just another example. Let me give you a third one. While they found workarounds here, by the way, it still came down to soldiers being innovative, adaptive, creative, and working through it with some mechanism of being able to bring a generator of their own, bring additional soldiers, increasing the amount of structure required for liaison when all we really wanted to do was have the data move naturally from one place to another so we could coordinate operations. But we had to put an element inside of there, and they did the job. Well, the solution we find for one partner doesn't always work for another. And I guess that'll be my last point here when it comes to communicating in a degraded environment. We had a solution that worked in Korea with that partner, but that solution was tried with our Japanese partners and it didn't work because there was a cultural gap on the willingness to have a shared command post. And that can't be ignored. So if we're going to have a shared command post with shared data moving in both directions and shared humans inside of there to work through the procedures together, we might be at the point where we have some security risks, some trust risks, some prestige risks, all of which can be there. And we find ourselves having to do a workaround like we did in this case, creating a separate coordination tent. There was neither the U.S. command post nor the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force command post. A separate one that was only for coordination. And it had limited data moving from each of the two originating nodes. Then it could be used and shared by humans who closed the gap through an error gap. Now you think about that, you go, wow. How can you build in electronic trust? Is that possible? Is it possible for the electronic trust to be variable depending on who it is that is seeking access and to be trusted? Maybe we can do that. Where we don't have to have these groups of humans. We don't have to have a third command post. We don't have to have the potential introduction of errors, which happens when humans are trying to solve a problem, but the limits of their capability can introduce errors and compound the problem of interoperability and increase the amount of degraded condition of the communication environment. So this is what I want your help with. I want to just lay that on you to just tell you that we are finding through our journeys that we have to be extraordinarily adaptive technologically, and we're not. We're not. A recent command post exercise with one of our high-end partners, with the Australians. It was a joint exercise, and we committed one of the Army's 3 corps, which happens to be a Pacific assigned corps, that's First Corps out of Joint Base Lewis McChord, as the Land Component Command for this joint task force that was led by 7th Fleet. So 2 joint partners working together. Within the Land Component Command, there were Australian ground troops, there were U.S. Marine ground troops, there were U.S. Army ground troops, and there were even some embedded Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force troops. Required 3 different command post screens in front of General Lanza. The Marine Corps system, the Army Command Post of the Future system, and the Australian Battle Command system. And then beneath that, we were trying to move data into and out of the Global Command and Control system. Geeks. Unsatisfactory, folks. It's not good enough. It worked. Steve Lanza was able to sense the operation, sense the battle, make timely decisions. But we were increasing his processing load, and we're increasing the gaps that might have occurred if we had taken a different approach. And so my challenge to you today is to help us close these gaps so that the technologies and that the procedures that are out there can get us a head start on being able to operate with advantage with our multinational, with our joint partners, whenever and wherever we go. You ask yourself the question, is our technology built to connect us to anyone, at any time, anywhere? If you come up with a yes, please see my G6 so we can make sure we get some of that. But if the answer is no, then we need your help. We have work to do, and we're not there yet. Remember, as I said, the United States, will be most likely to be the nucleus, if not the actual leader, of any coalition into which we participate. What I mean by nucleus is that it's going to be our command and control system, our ability to link others together and to guide them, that will be an advantage to anyone that chooses to work with us. It's a clear competitive advantage for the United States in our ability to conduct operations. It's part of the magic. And so others are going to connect to us. Help us do that a bit more simply. Help us to improve the connections so that we can concentrate our time and our energy and our exercises on actually working through the degraded conditions that are induced by an adversary, so we can defeat that adversary and impose degraded conditions on them. That's where we want to concentrate our attention, not in the workarounds that have to occur before we have contact with any adversary. So that's my challenge to you. I appreciate the chance to throw that out on your lap. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of indigestion, but will cause you to have lots of discussion and dialogue as you go through the rest of the TechNet journey today. Hopefully that stimulates you for some questions as well, and I'm willing to take those now. So thank you all very much for your support, and let's see what questions you have.
Sir, first question. Could you please discuss the evolving challenges of cyber defense and securing communications in a joint environment?
Yeah, sure. Even without adding the joint part to the question, and I'll come back to that, securing one's own communications, protecting one's own networks, and frankly, causing there to be a significant penalty to anyone who comes to tamper with our networks is a complex problem. It requires the fusion of communications, intelligence, and, broadly speaking, cyber operations and activities. All three of those disciplines have to be brought together in a very focused and fused way. And that sounds simple, but when we really think about the policies that are associated with each one of those various disciplines, there's a need for some separation there. All right, so how much access do you want to give cyber operators from an intelligence perspective to be able to see into the entire array of threats and hazards out there, including home-generated ones? Or do you want to protect privacy? So it's the trade-offs that are associated with security anyway that certainly apply to the cyber domain and I think are amplified there. So that's a challenge by itself. How are we going to organize for that? And there have been a number of steps taken, the creation of U.S. Cyber Command, the components thereof, the U.S. Army Cyber and Communications Center of Excellence at Fort Gordon, Georgia, that's been structured differently, the new specialties that have been created for this purpose of people who understand fusion from the three disciplines, and we're growing a leader corps and a technician corps to be able to deal with those realities so they can operate in a disciplined way, protecting civil liberties where appropriate, but also not letting someone have free reconnaissance on our electronic systems and networks. So that's where we are. It's a challenge. When you add the joint aspect of that, that increases the complexity. So there are the joint aspects that have to do with the workarounds that I alluded to. Every time there's a workaround, you have a potential vulnerability that's exploitable by cyber actors. We have to protect in those gap spaces that we're trying to create workarounds. Similarly with our multinational partners. Trust, access, limitation are, I think, the keys to being able to work through this. But it's an ongoing challenge. It's going to take a large group of committed professionals, like-minded individuals who are trying to find solutions to this problem while keeping the right amount of balance as well. So that's how I see it. I'll take another one.
Sir, can you talk to the interoperability problems during Operation Tomodachi?
Yeah, so Tomodachi, of course, was the complex response that began with a tsunami and ended up being a nuclear response and a massive humanitarian assistance and disaster response event in Japan a few years ago. I wasn't directly a participant in that, but I can tell you that we continue to study the lessons from Tomodachi, the lessons from Damayan, the lessons from the most recent Nepal earthquake response. The lessons remain the same each time. And while we may find some individual solutions, to a particular problem, we may lash something down like a coalition partner network of sorts, or a network that makes it possible for us to share with non-governmental entities and share awareness. And we do have some solutions to that were not available during Tomodachi. So while we continue to study those lessons, we also still find we have many things that are not yet adequately addressed. And I've really alluded to those already. So who were the partners in Tomodachi? Well, certainly it was the Japan Self-Defense Forces, the Japanese government, but that wasn't it. Lots of people have relationships with Japan, and the growth of the coalition multiplies so quickly, exponentially, in the time when the country that has the crisis has the least ability to respond and absorb additional partners. So who does that? Coalition coordination is what does that, and whole-of-government coordination cells tend to do that. And that was a lesson that came out of Tomodachi, and we've applied that each time to these subsequent operations to try to build a multinational coordination center. That's the term of art that we have. And we build that into all of our exercises to make sure that anyone with whom we operate is going to expect that and will find benefit from that when the disaster is happening in their country, or when they're responding to a disaster in another country. They'll know to join that multinational coordination center as early as possible. And often we're the network operator for that. At the very least, we're the fusion point for that, procedurally and technically in many cases. And we try to do that from a spirit of trust, and that's proving beneficial to us as we go around. Some partners are still not willing to do that. And the question was about Tomodachi, but I'm going to extend the lesson into the Nepal earthquake response that happened over the past year. 3 major country contributions happened in support of Nepal. There were many, many more countries involved, but there were 3 sectors that were assigned to 3 country leads. There was an Indian sector, there was an American-led sector, and there was a Chinese sector. And with the number of partners that came in on that, it was necessary to establish a multinational coordination center, as we had done in exercises with the Nepalese, rehearsing the response to an earthquake several times over the last 3 or 4 years. Well, the Chinese didn't have the cultural readiness to do that, even though we've been exercising with the Chinese in disaster response. By the way, we have an exercise happening this week in Washington State with the People's Liberation Army on disaster response. And we're going to apply some of these lessons from Nepal to this year's exercise scenario to try to move them a step closer toward being willing to have that cultural willingness, that cultural trust to come into a multinational coordination center. So the China sector was independent, wasn't connected to the other ones. There were inefficiencies in the response because of that. There were lost opportunities in coordination across boundaries because of that. And we can't be satisfied. Those are Tomodachi lessons. And they continue to inform us and advance us, but also to tell us that we still have a long way to go. I'll take another one.
Sir, does the Army exercise and train to operate without comms in either U.S. or joint training exercises, especially without satellite comms?
Without comms would be an overstatement. No, we do not train to operate without comms. There will have to be some level of communication for us to be able to do the complex work of guiding hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands of independent human wills, which is what land operations are all about. So if I tell a brigade to turn to the right, that brigade will have 4,500 individual wills and individual actions to turn to the right. 4,500. we must have communications. So the level of communication we go to, whether it's satellite communications over great distance or radio to satellite interfaces, which we sometimes need when you have a tactical unit that's operating in one area that's connected to a larger, higher headquarters, or dispersed units in different areas where we have an interface, or whether it's the long-range, long-haul communications that we have to have when we're projecting small units away from their primary operating areas and bases. All those things create a challenge for us. And we find that we do have to practice working through different levels of that being degraded. Sometimes it comes, as Wayne Brock often teases me when I say this, but I'm teasing him when I say it. It's always degraded. It's never all there. We're always working through something anyway. To take out a layer of communications is part of what we do in exercises. And I can tell you it hurts. So when you drop satellite for a while, or you drop us from strategic to tactical only for a while, and you limit the amount of data that can move at a given point in time as a result of that, or you constrain it or drop certain nodes in a network, we feel it. There's no doubt about it, because we are what we designed ourselves to be. We're a digitally enabled, network-centric military force. And as a result, there's some vulnerabilities. And the vulnerability is what's in the nature of this question. How are you dealing with that vulnerability? We can still operate at the lower, the trailing end of that continuum of capability I talked about. Remember, the U.S. must be at the cutting edge of communications technology, command control, intelligence, and information sharing. We have to be at the cutting edge. It's part of our competitive advantage. But because our partners will not always be there, we must also maintain proficiency at the trailing edge. That's harder to do because it's very difficult to commit resources to that, other than to do what this question alludes to, which is drop some of the capabilities and make sure you're still proficient on doing hand and arm signals if you need to, couriers, wire. I'll tell you that's harder because we don't have the resources anymore for those things. All the spools of wire are gone out of our small units now. They're gone. All the switchboards are gone. And if they were there, someone would go, what on earth is that? Is that something you found in a tunnel at Fort Shafter? The answer is, well, yeah, it's very similar to what's in the tunnels at Fort Shafter. It looks just like it. But that capability is gone. And so there is a risk to what happens if we're degraded. We just have to know that. That's why our cyber defenses are so important here. It's a known risk. And I'm not saying something our adversaries don't already know. They know that. What they don't know is how agile we are. And what happens when we get degraded? We don't stop. For others, we cause paralysis. And we do that on purpose. We will cause cybernetic paralysis, where leaders of other entities can't decide. And if they do decide, no one can hear their decision. We will do that. And our adversaries are going to try to do the same. But we find ourselves to be far more resilient than they are. Some of that is through practice. Some of it's through rehearsing redundancies. And some of that is just simply from our operations that we do with other partners throughout the region who are at a different part of that spectrum. Okay, I think I'm reaching the hook point, but again, I appreciate those questions. I hope that adds to your joy and your stimulation of having had a landsman up here talking to you today. I wish you well in the rest of the conference, and any hard questions that I didn't get to address, throw those at Wayne Brock, and he'll be happy to take them. So thank you all very much.